It is my honor and privilege to introduce our first keynote speaker, Duaba. Duaba is a cultural worker, writer, community educator, and grassroots arts administrator whose home is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was born and raised in New Orleans, where his experiences of anti-Black government systems, socio-ecological disasters, and dysfunctional public works shaped his consciousness. By witnessing the ways colonizing institutions and communication systems are used to repress transformative discourse, he turned to publication, facilitation, organizational development, and ritual design as his mediums of choice for counteracting the neo-colonial imagination. He is currently working on two major projects, Confluence and East Lake Studio for Community Design, where he is building a free university for community-led urban development called the Institute for Urban Vitality. And as an organizer in the Wild Path Collective, where he is engaged in a group effort to free up 100 acres of land in the St. Croix River Valley to establish a cultural land commons for Black, Indigenous, and people of culture. Thank you so much, Duaba, for your presence and sharing space with us this morning.
Peace. Can y'all hear me all right? Cool. All right, well, gratitude to you, Bella, for your words. I think we were in sync because we're right on the same page and starting with our families. And what came up for me as you were speaking is that our families are our homeland, especially for us people who have been displaced into diaspora. So as I was writing this essay, I interviewed my father, who is a Black Creole man from the Bayou in Louisiana. His hometown throughout history has been the home territory of the Homa and Chitimacha nations, the site of massive sugarcane plantations, extractive oil and mineral mining, the home of Louisiana's Ku Klux Klan, and also the home of some of the fiercest Black and Native folks in the state. So he's seen some wild shit, you know what I'm saying? And I interviewed him about how our family was mixed with African, Indigenous, and European roots, and how we identified as both Black and Creole. And it kind of occurred to me as we talked that while we aren't the last people in our family to be mixed, we were likely the last people in our family who might ever identify as Creole. And when I asked him if that mattered to him, he told me no. And when I asked him why, he hit me with this proverb. And so my daddy told me to tell y'all that Pops said, Creole, mulatto, Sabines, that's all some shit from the plantation. It started in the desert and it made its way to the swamp. So I want to break that proverb down a little bit. And then I want to share two more proverbs from mixed Black communities here in the Americas. And I guess I should preface this a bit by saying that these terms, Creole, mulatto, Sabine, these are names that European people gave to the mixed children of Black and Indigenous folks. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that because our names give us our destiny. Creole is a French adoption of the Portuguese word crioulo, meaning new creation. And originally it was a name given to the children of enslaved Africans born in the colonies on Turtle Island. Mulatto is a really well-known one. It's also a metaphor. It means mule. And it was used originally to refer to anyone of mixed roots in Spain before later being applied to anyone of mixed African and European heritage. It's also likely that that word is a Spanish and Portuguese adoption of the Arabic word muwallad, which originally describes someone of mixed Arab, Berber, and European descent, and now refers to some people of mixed African and Arab descent. And finally, Sabine was an epithet that white slave barons and plantation communities gave to the Houma people, one of the many indigenous nations of Louisiana, or what became it, and also to a community of mixed native peoples known as the Red Bones in West Louisiana. And so in the case of mulatto and Sabine, the terms are definitely epithets because mules are sterile, and Sabine trees, as I was taught, were considered useless by the colonizers. And finally, the root of Creole is the word cria, which is a Portuguese word that referred to a house servant. So in the proverb that my pop shared with me, there's a lot to unpack. In particular, what my pop means by it started in the desert and made its way to the swamp is he's talking about the ways that the roots of mixed identities in Louisiana, and I would say the larger world, are not just born of the plantation experience, but of larger projects of so-called white racial groups to create global empires that dominate the planet. Not just light-skinned Europeans, but also light-skinned people of Southwestern Asia, in particular, Arab and communities from the Arabian Peninsula and Persian Gulf, all of whom engaged in practices of mass enslavement of dark-skinned African people, and later on in the modern day formed mixed families with Black people. Through the transatlantic slave trade into the Iberian Peninsula that we now call Spain, Portugal, Southern France, as well as the British Isles, and the trans-Saharan slave trade into the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, mixed populations whose roots were in empire and slavery were formed. And a common thread between these experiences is a very tangible anti-Black sentiment and politics that are embedded into these identities and as empires who sought to enslave Black people. That sentiment is rooted in nearly 700 years of war between light-skinned Europeans and darker-skinned, multicultural, Afro-Arab empires, the so-called Moors. And the root of those centuries of conflict were long-standing wars of conquest and independence between Christians and Muslims in the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and Persia. And so in other words, the anti-Blackness of this society that we still experience is born out of more than 1,000 years of so-called holy war between empires. And though that war took place along the line of religion, as well as skin color. So beyond my pop's proverb, there are two other proverbs that I want to share to frame up this talk. The first is from Louisiana, and that is, if you put a mulatto on an old horse, he'll swear his mama wasn't Black. And the second is from Brazil, and that one is money whitens. What I take away from these proverbs is not only are some mixed race identities shaped by vast and terrifying histories of military conquests, systematic rape of people and land, genocide, and enslavement, but within such societies, mixed people and likewise all people are socialized to pursue some form of whiteness. And to be white is to own property and to support the systems of white social power that turn living and non-living entities into property. And finally, that race is not just a matter of parentage, but also a matter of time, place, and proximity, often to whiteness. But what is unique about the recruitment of mixed race people into projects of white racial domination is in the ways that mixed peoples are named and deployed by people leading projects of economic and social domination, whether on the streets of poor Black and brown communities as police forces or in media productions as representatives of a world without race. The intention is to enforce the sterilizing political imagination of whiteness upon oppressed people through mixed folks and anyone else who is available to support the work. Depending on our parentage, we may be socialized in the same ways that white people are to participate in violence that extends the power of the empire's colonies and plantations. And we also may be socialized to fight against it. So I want to open this section of this essay by sharing that for me, the contradictions and history of racial identity systems reveal the ways that race is not just a social construction. Racial identity, like all identities, are a social institution. And what that means is we use these identities to determine the ways that social power and material resources flow to us and the type and quality of action that we take within the world. In the United States, and to my understanding in Southwest Asia and Eastern Africa, racial systems were formed with very different sets of rules, but the primary purpose of those racial identity systems was to control the acquisition of political power and property by people who were meant to be exploited by society. And I'll say more about that later. But what I see is that throughout history, wherever there's an arrangement of white and black, or white, black, indigenous, colored, whether that meant brown, Asian, or mixed people, these systems were created in a time where race was not fixed. It was a matter of convenience to those who were in power. And so there are many times in the history of Louisiana, for example, where one day Creole or mulatto people, free people of color, who enjoyed freedom from enslavement and access to property, whether small or large amounts of that, would suddenly become Black by law, and they were re-enslaved the day after. And in these times, those people organized to protest being divested from their property through being racially marked as Black, and often campaigned for their recognition in plantation society as whites or as a separate racial group entirely that was allowed to own property. And that is a historic trend in our context, especially in the United States and Canada, and likely as well in Eastern Africa, where the slave trade was largely managed by people of Afro-Asian ancestry. Much of the recent activism to have multiracial identity treated as its own identity has also been rooted in anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Asian, and anti-Hispanic sentiments. It's often been led by white women who have children who are darker skinned. And so it's no surprise today that in this time where critical race theory is under attack, where we've shifted from a fascist presidency and into a neoliberal capitalist presidency, the discussion of who are mixed people and who are mixed people to the empire has resurfaced. And now even some Black and brown parents are choosing to raise their children as mixed without realizing that they're potentially socializing their children to be assistants to white power. And for example, a common metaphor for mixed people is that our destiny is to serve as bridges between cultures. But I find that messed up because often what's unspoken is that a mixed child is often a one-way street for power to flow away from their darker skinned, more overtly oppressed ancestors towards their often lighter skinned ancestors who are more covertly complicit with this oppressive power structure we live in. And also that this metaphor mostly centers people with ancestry shared between a parent from an economically powerful community and an economically deprived one. So in going back to my pop, what I'm getting at by sharing all this history is that we should be mindful that in this society that we live in for the last 1,300 years, we've been socialized as its citizens or subjects into practices of deeply violent anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Asian, anti-Muslim, and on culture. There's a tremendous amount of social pressure and coercive violence that's put in place by people of authority in this society to prevent any resistance to this racist social practice. And so for my pop and other members of my family, my grandfather, my mothers, to have taken some stance against this social force of anti-Blackness, especially given their mixed heritage, it took many generations of struggle to resist that violence. And it is likely true for anyone else living in this society who has not been socialized into an overtly oppressive racist form of social life. And what that means to me is that this system of white racial dominance is not impossible to beat, though it is difficult, and it takes determination. And the primary source of resistance and the determination to resist is in communities who are prepared to educate themselves out of being oppressors and who are preparing themselves to be accomplices to the movements that escape and unmake empire. And so if we're upset by this history and the situation that we're in, as we should be, then perhaps it also means that we who are people of mixed roots, who are descendants of this world built through empire, it means that we have to mature politically and acquire the power needed to abolish all forms of domination and white racial imperialism in particular. And that's it. The soul of this talk is about what it could look like to make that work central to our lives, because we're living in the times of our ancestors, a time of global pandemic, global warfare, dysfunctional governments, mass enslavement through prisons and industrial plantations, large-scale ecological destruction, and out-of-control social elites. While some of our ancestors were fighting for recognition and political power within the plantation, the rulers of the plantations were also uprooting old growth forests, diverting rivers and swamps, and carving into the belly of the earth for shiny rocks. And they were pushing indigenous people from the lands they called home to be cleared and worked by the subjects of the empire. So we've always been in those times. In part, I'm inspired by this quote from Grace Lee Boggs, who I would say in her own way is a mixed person, through deeply identifying with the liberation struggles of Chinese and African-American family, as well as through identifying with the global struggles of people fighting capitalism. She said that our challenge in this millennium is to say no to the existing power structure and empower ourselves and our people to embrace the power within them. She also said that in setting out to organize ourselves to gain power and use our power, we must also give ourselves educations which prepare ourselves and our children to govern. And she also said that as we win our victories, we must be prepared for new contradictions in society to emerge. And for people of mixed roots, fighting oppression in a plantation society, our lives have been shaped by a constant ebb and flow of victories, big and small, and of constantly emerging contradictions. And so I think the challenge of this experience that we share is in not being discouraged by the heat of that tension, of the contradictions, and also of not being X'd out by the people invested in keeping the plantation the way it is. Some of you may also know that the title of this talk is inspired by Peggy McIntosh's 1989 essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And there are some lines that I appreciate from that essay, but my main response to it is that the social advantages of white people and other advantaged populations is, as W.B. Du Bois once remarked, a wage, a psychological wage for participation in horrific social violence that makes white power possible. In other words, inside the rich white man's bag is an army and a deed to a plantation and a railroad of bones and stolen lives that he rode to get to the top. And inside a poor white man's bag is an IOU from a rich man that might or might not get cashed. But for the survivors of this violence, the violence of white privilege, male privilege, class privilege, and so on, that violence is not invisible. And at its least harmful, it is implied by the correctional officer's baton, the policeman's squad car, the soldier's machine gun, or the film directors in Hollywood or on the 6 o'clock news. And at worst, we experience and participate in life-ending violence. We receive and deal wounds that often hurt worse than dying because that pain can be felt across generations. And what I'm not saying is that oppressed people can uniquely see something invisible or something hiding in plain sight. It means those of us given overseer status in this plantation economy can learn to unsee the violence that we participate in or condone to earn our psychological wages. We learn to unsee it because we fear the pains of resisting the architects of this plantation pecking order. There's so much fear that we are afraid to drop everything and throw fire to the bales of cotton at the docks, or to pull up the pipelines under the river, or to tear down the prisons. So intense is the fear of resistance that for many of us, it can feel like our collective abilities to imagine a world without this kind of violence have withered away. And as the Creoles in Louisiana say, idleness leaves the frog without an ass to sit on. But another critique I have of the privilege framework is that it doesn't advance an awareness of the magnitude, intensity, and regularity with which this violence in our society occurs against people and the planet. As with all forms of harm, the burden of that work has often been on the survivors. And I feel that the magnitude of violence that this society engages in requires more than a performative act of self-awareness, like recognizing who has privilege, how they have it, when they have it, or even what they should do with it. Because power conferred to us by a system of white racial domination can only open doors deeper into the big house of the plantation, but power conferred to us by community, cooperation, and our collective determination to govern ourselves, to grow strong and confident in ourselves, to live in harmony with the earth and one another is what opens doors towards the next world. Where I agree with Peggy McIntosh is in her statement that it is not enough to disprove of the violence of this system. Action must be taken to uproot it, and action must be taken to strengthen our own systems of power. I think it's valuable to make people aware of the ways we're socialized to be violent and harm one another. I think it's more generative to come to grips and to come to blows with the social system that doles out the psychological wages and material advantages that overseer status grants us. And most importantly, I think we must acknowledge that we also have to prepare ourselves to build our own systems of power, because we'll find that any systems built to top oppression have little to offer us. So what we're faced with is not so much a crisis of imagination. We're faced with a crisis of debilitating suffering and trauma, as Bella shared earlier. And in order to assert our own power as a community, we have to practice operating and strengthening the social systems, institutions, and practices that liberate us. And in the process, that might cause the plantation to wither, because we're more invested in tending our own gardens than the colony's fields. I came to this conclusion because of the way I grew up in the South. To survive in the South with your soul intact as a Black person, you have to have some form of life-affirming faith in the power of Black people and other people fighting their oppressors. And I think that the plantation conditions us to recognize the power of those trusted to be overseers within it exclusively: the wealthy, the light-skinned, the college-educated, and so on. And in taking up that position, that obsessive focus on whiteness, we ignore the ways that people resisting also have a source and form of social power. And if they didn't, we wouldn't need to have armies or police forces to hem folks up. So I was brought up to identify with the inherent dignity and power in the people around me. And what sensitized me to how messed up things were experiences I had with Black elders in my community who would make themselves shrink because my skin was lighter than theirs, and I would feel disgusted by my own presence and saddened by what had happened to them. And also by the teasing that I got about my own skin color from my family and friends that made it clear to me that colorism within our community was not acceptable. And there was finally a recognition that more so than privilege, we have an obligation to our communities and our descendants to strike a death blow to any man-made systems and social arrangements that make an anti-Black society possible. I think it's self-defeating, and I welcome y'all's critiques about this, but I think it's self-defeating to argue over the ways that the advantages of having light skin overshadow the collective power of darker skinned Black people or indigenous people or poor people more broadly. I think the collective power of any people surviving oppression will be made known through the ferocity of their resistance. As Frederick Douglass says, the limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Find out what a people will submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong that will be imposed upon them. And these will continue until they are resisted with words or fists. So for anyone who has some form of privilege, some form of overseer status in this society, we should ask ourselves, in claiming that we are uniquely empowered by this system, are we prepared to prove it? Knowing that having this power means we are required to engage in extreme and unusual violence against people disempowered within this society, even fighting ourselves. And after what we've seen in 2020 of people's resistance to this oppression, are we really prepared to be taken to task by those resisting it? How much do we really trust in our money, or skin color and the police mercenaries that these things might purchase to protect us from rebellions of oppressed people. If we can't have faith in our privilege to protect us, then it's probably not real power. So what I would add to Baba Douglas's words are, we are socialized, coerced, and persuaded to oppress one another. And so there are injustices imposed upon people given overseer passes on this plantation, and these privileges are meant to malnourish the collective power of our communities. So I just want to share finally a little bit about my family, and I want to start with my mothers, because they shaped these conclusions that I've come to. My mother was a Black woman from New Orleans. Her mother, my grandmama, was a Black woman from St. Mary's Parish, Louisiana, and so was my great-grandmama and my great-great-grandmama, and they were all of mixed roots. My grandmama and her 11 or so siblings were raised speaking Louisiana Creole. She was also enrolled in the Homa Nation through her father, a Black and Indigenous man, although this was never something that we spoke about. In the 1930 census, my great-great-grandmama and my great-grandmama are listed either as mulatto or Black. And as far back as I can find, they were also free people of color who lived very, very poor, but free off the bayous in Louisiana. And I suspect that's so because they have a marriage certificate dated to 1854, before the formal abolition of enslavement, when formal marriages between Black people were illegal and therefore unrecognized by the state. My relationship with my grandmama, my mama, my pop, my stepmama have been some of the most formative in my life and in the work that I do in community and social movement. My grandmama raised me from birth to around 10, and though people often said she could pass for white, she always identified racially as Black and participated in Black community. So in my childhood and more generally growing up in Louisiana, like other places in the Caribbean, it was common to see white passing folks who were Black, identified deeply with their Blackness, participated in Black community, and if you called them anything else, it would be a fight. And so that temperament, for me, normalized Blackness and Black culture in me. And when people set out to deny that in me, I fought them too, until I got older. I never wanted to be isolated from my roots. My grandmama was our family's matriarch. She moved to the 7th Ward of New Orleans with my grandfather, with a big migration of Black people to the city from across the Gulf Coast after the end of World War II. Neither of them finished elementary school, so they both were left working odd jobs. But I remember that while my grandmother was a domestic worker by day, in her retirement, she hustled pecan candy and sweets. She was the neighborhood card shark. She taught me how to make prison wine, how to pray, and speak broken Creole. She and my pop spoiled me while my mother and brother disciplined me, and we all loved each other fiercely. In the summertime, she would bring me out to the country in Louisiana, where she and her siblings grew up, working on a family farm in St. Mary's Parish, which was the site of some of the most intense slavery in the state, a land of massive sugarcane plantations run by the French and Anglo-American whites, and by extension, the site of massive displacement of indigenous people. Eventually, that land fell to the control of giant families of Creoles, free people of color, and formerly enslaved Black people, before once again being lost to white wealthy families around the 2000s. Those trips awakened me to my love for the earth and to the long history of our family and the complexities of power in our society. My father's father, Papa, was a Creole man as well, whose mother could also nearly pass for white, whose own father was a light-skinned, Black, mixed man. My papa grew up raised by his brothers who kept him out of life on the streets in Houma, Louisiana, and how he came up allowed him to identify deeply with Blackness and Black people throughout his life. And he served our community there as an educator, a community administrator, and a mentor to people. What allowed our family to openly affirm our identities as both Black and mixed, Black and Indigenous, Black and Creole, was our kinship to Black and Indigenous people. Because in the cities of Louisiana, Creole, colored, mulatto families often were able to acquire more property than those in rural areas, and the cost of poverty in the city was harsh in a different way than it was in the countryside. And so I think many developed a fierce possessiveness over first whiteness, then light skin, and the overseer statuses that both of those things conveyed. And finally, when the whites created a system of white, Black, and Creole and other, some Creole families then had to police the passage of property from light to darker skinned relatives, and a whole culture of anti-Black sentiment and politics emerged within some of the population, enough so that those social tensions still remain in the city. For our family, many of our ancestors had parents, spouses, siblings who had known slavery directly, who had survived genocide, who knew and had bad blood with their white parents from the slave-bearing class. Women in our family seemed to be the main force that transmitted Black consciousness to its members, and this empowered many of the men and children in our family to do the same. And so my mama, stepmama, my pop, his mama, my brothers, we all cover a different range of skin tones and ancestries, and I'm deeply grateful to them all for the ways they taught me, teased me, conscientized me, to the ways skin color politics, gender oppression, class violence occurred in the South and how it affected our family. And I'm also grateful for the ways that in New Orleans, race and skin color are complicated by the history of it as a colony and its legends. These in turn gave me the analysis of power that I have, that power is not just one directional, it exists in everyone, and it is a matter of context and action. So for example, in the early days of the Louisiana colony, one of the first executioners in the city was a free African man from Congo, and he had the authority from the colonial government to kill both white and Black. And of course, there's Marie Laveau, a Black Creole woman who is both a devout Catholic and a voodoo queen, who saved hundreds of people in the city during a pandemic, and who was later sanctified into a saint and then deified into a goddess by people of the city. So through my upbringing, through my conversations with my family about our mixed heritage, and through my conversations with my chosen family, which is a blended family, through my conversations with my partner, even in my pop's lack of attachment to his Creole identity and his unspoken, unspeakable even love of Blackness, all of them have taught me about the ways that identities are not permanent, nor are they purposeless. Identities are tools. And when we see race, class, gender, and also nationality, religion, and so on, as social institutions, rather than social constructions, it becomes more clear that the reasons we uphold an identity are as numerous and shifting as drops of water in a river. And sometimes we hold an identity until we outgrow it or it no longer serves us, like alumni status at a racist ass college. Some identities that we hold have such a profound impact on us that we can never not identify with it, like the ways that we identify with a particular land or ecosystem. For me, who I am is defined by the totality of the Mississippi River Valley. And other identities we take up and honor because of kinship, relationship, to count ourselves amongst ancestors and warriors who have held the same sense of self that we do. So I think that most importantly, whether we define ourselves by our race, tribe, nation, culture, what makes our identity more than social constructions is the ways that our identities must be affirmed and embodied in our actions, by the ways we maintain relation to people, place, and these energies that animate the universe, which we sometimes call gods. Before the rise of empires based on race, relationship and contribution determined who we would claim as our people and who would claim us in return. We live in a society that uses institutions like racial categories, blood quantum sciences, and psychology to construct and actualize hierarchies of domination. The action which makes these identities given to us on the plantation real is the overseer's whip, of the violence it implies, of the act of witnessing that violence be carried out, and the act of surviving its lashes. In a society based on coercion and socialization for warfare and economic domination, it is likely that all identities are actualized into us through violence, whether overt, covert, or through fearful compliance. So in sharing that, I want to shift from my roots a little bit to talk more generally about the formation and the intentionality behind identity in this context of oppression to set us up to have more of a conversation about it. And to do so, I want to talk about the theory of racial capitalism, first set out by scholars and activists resisting apartheid in South Africa, and later expanded upon by two Black scholars, Oliver Cromwell Cox and Cedric J. Robinson. So what we know for sure is that America was established by European empires who justified their invasion, domination, and exploitation of other people and the earth based on the supposed supremacy of the white race. And having made the claim, they set out to build a global system of capitalism rooted in racial capitalism, where all wealth extracted from people and the planet would find its way into the hands of a white ruling class, the politicians, the bankers, the generals, the factory owners, and other social leaders who direct society. It meant that the people and the planet both had to be materialized or commoditized into capital, which is basically a polite way of saying something that's useless on its own, but is useful in making a finished product, like the way flour and eggs are useful ingredients in making pancakes or the devil's pie. So Europeans created a white racial empire that practiced white racial capitalism in this way. First, they engaged in racial military conquest when they deployed their armies and religious officials to establish a global network of colonies and supply chains defended by military forts, navies, and puppet governments that ran back to the hearts of their empire. These armies engaged in genocide, plunder, systematic rape, and destroyed the governments of indigenous people whose land and people they sought to steal. And then the empire sent its citizens and prisoners to engage in white racial colonialism. And so people built colonies that operated plantation economies, whether those were agricultural plantations or manufacturing plantations. And once those colonies were built and ships began to sail back and forth between the heart of empire and the colonies full of goods and gold and stolen souls, a global system of white economic domination was fully operational. And to maintain these economies, racial hierarchies were established and maintained to control people, conquered or allied to the empire. Over each century and up to this day, the empire we live in has repeated this pattern of racial military conquest, racial colonization, and racial hierarchy maintenance. The purpose of these practices is to establish and maintain a global system of racial capitalism. And since people are starting to shoot Tesla cars into space, you already know what time it is. In an empire, the function of our identities is to determine what wealth can be extracted from us. Our identities are maintained by the threat of armed violence, economic deprivation, and social institutions such as race and gender, and also the colonial education systems which teach us how to perform these identities. So when people that reject their assigned identity or reject the institutions created to maintain them, it's bad for business. And if it's bad for the empire's business, then they make it bad for you. But what about people who nonetheless choose to defy categorization and disempowerment by race, gender, ability, culture? Well, at first the empire tries to hide them, then the empire tries to kill them. And when that fails, the empire tries to recruit them. And often the empire associated with these identities it assigns to us, the identities that it gave to conquered people, it associated those with the specific services or goods that they needed to extract from those people. Some people were conditioned by the empire to produce soldiers and police. Others were conditioned to become factory workers, others farmers, others sex workers. And other people were so abused and degraded by society that they were trapped in intergenerational slavery. To maintain this social arrangement, the empire used written and socially upheld laws to make sure that people stayed in their place and stayed in their race. Ruling elites in the empire created and maintained hierarchies of status and power between groups of people made superficially different using the race, which the root word of race is family, so the family of the person, as a determining factor, as well as the person's phenotype. So our family and our appearance was what determined our race. And you know how the rest goes. Each race has a different level of social mobility, economic advantages, and purpose in the empire based on the origin story that has been given to us by the empire. And so Cedric Robinson tells us that even before the European elite established global race-based empires, the ruling classes of the region engaged in warfare, colonization, enslavement, and economic domination against one another. And few people were willing to accept their loss of political power and autonomy by war. And so resistance to being fully conquered was always constant. So European empires did what all the empires before them did, because it was more costly to exterminate rebellious people than it was to enslave or assimilate them into the larger kingdom or empire. So each empire found its own ways to buy consent or crush resistance of the people they conquered. And to crush resistance, they had to erase conquered people's memories and capacities to govern their own nations. Otherwise, they would continue to desire their autonomy from empire. And so the racial identities, any identity that we have in this context, is an attempt to replace our sense of ourselves as a nation of people who have the right to govern ourselves. And this sense of self-determination was often stomped out by acts of terror, brutality, and also by providing social and financial advantages to those who accepted the rule of empire and worked for it. And so the empire replaced our political systems and cultural practices with identities that were useful to the economics of the empire. So if we take into account the names that we are given under this empire, the racial names on our birth certificates are colors, are derived from colors, whose symbols are emptiness, from sterilized beasts of burden and nuisance plants. I think it means that our society, this empire, is afraid of the abundance that lay potent and waiting inside of darkness. It is afraid of the fertile imagination of children born with the knowledge of where the holes in the plantation fence are and which doors are unlocked. It is afraid of people whose core sense of self is born from a relationship to an immortal planet rather than a man-child pretending to be a god king on some hard-ass chair in a castle in Europe. My roots are mixed and I am Black on purpose. And I will grow towards whatever new sense of identity and name and destiny we collectively choose. Through my actions, I choose the steps that bring me closer to people and practices that will unmake this society rooted in exploitation of all life and deeper into the life-giving, abundant Black energy whose potential can only be known by embracing it. And so the question that I want to introduce to our community is this: as people of mixed roots, as we affirm our experiences of holding mixed ancestry or mixed family, as we create a collective identity for ourselves, how are we educating ourselves and our kinfolk to become aware of the traps laid out by this empire that has brought us all together and failed to kill within us a desire to live in a society rooted in love of one another, of justice, of the planet, and of autonomy? And what are we doing to document that so that we can pass it on? In essence, how are we preparing ourselves to govern? So that's it for my talk. I just want to express my gratitude to the organizers of this space, the participants, the workshop facilitators. I think the importance of spaces like Midwest Mixed is that it gives us a space where people of mixed roots can heal and recover our imagination and determine our place in the larger struggle to end domination of people in the planet. And in spaces like these, our wisdom can grow and our wounds can scar over and the trauma within us can be made into medicine. It can become an antidote for our fears of building the world that we desire. So, deep gratitude to all of y'all, and thank you for hearing my wild ass out.